Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Today I'm going to cover Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David W. Blight. This is book 41 of 52 for my 2020 reading list. And I'm going to start by reading from page 744. The crowd in the pews were on their feet cheering as Douglass reached these crescendos. Then the exhausted old orator folded his text to sit down. A reporter for the Evening Star recorded, "Thus spoke Frederick Douglass, with uplifted eyes and arms, as if to invoke heaven to bear witness, and the echoes of his words were drowned in a tumultuous storm of applause. Douglass remained slightly bent during the address," wrote the journalist, "but performed with voice unshaken. Just as he had begun his career 54 years earlier, he fought with his only real weapon, the infinity, majesty, and power of words." Douglass concluded, "Based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, your republic will stand and flourish forever." Then he dropped his arms and bowed. End quote. Last year I read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, covered it on this podcast, and loved that book. It was 76 pages, and it was some of the most powerful words, paragraphs, chapters that I've ever read. Each paragraph actually felt like a chapter. He would pack so much in to a paragraph. Each chapter almost had the feel of an entire book. It was one of the most important books I've read for this project, and it created a desire in me to want to know more about this man. And so when I saw this book pop up, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, saw that it was a Pulitzer Prize winner, and saw that it was a large book, my interest got sparked because I wanted to know more. And Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass stops around the year 1844 when Douglass escapes slavery. So he's born in 1818. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass goes to about 1844, but he lives until 1895. So what happened in those years? That's what I wanted to know, and that's why I picked up this book. So who was Frederick Douglass? Well, I encourage you to listen to the other episode as well, covering Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, because that talks a lot about his early life. But I'll cover a few basics here. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in Maryland in 1818. He took the name Douglass after he escaped from slavery, and slaves that escaped often took different names so that they would not be found. And so that Douglass is the name that he took. It's based off of a character in a Sir Walter Scott poem. The poem is Lady of the Lake, and there's a Highlander clan name of Douglass. And so Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey became Frederick Douglass and kept that name the rest of his life. He was born a slave in Maryland in 1818 to a black mother and a white father. The white father was probably his slave master, but he never found out for sure. It actually kind of made me wonder if with the DNA testing now, I just kind of wonder if his descendants, if they did that, if they'd be able to find out. I don't know if it goes back that far, but be curious to see, because he kind of guesses who might be his father, but you're never sure. And Douglass even asks different people throughout his life and just never gets a solid response. At the age of 6, he's dropped off by his grandmother to begin work. And so that was the last time he saw his grandmother. And if you just try to imagine that as a 6-year-old, of being dropped off by the woman who raised you, and that's it. You start working from that point. You are a slave. Unbelievable. Reading led to a huge breakthrough in his life. One of his slave master's wives started teaching him how to read. That was a no-no, and the husband of that wife who was teaching Douglass to read told her that if she continued to teach him, it would forever make him unfit for the duties of a slave. Douglass caught on that reading and education was important because of that, and taught himself to read. He had a conversion experience in the year 1831 where he became a Christian and began reading the Bible extensively. On Monday, September 3rd, 1838, he escaped by train from Baltimore to New York City. And this was one of the things I wanted to know, because in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, he says this. On the 3rd day of September, 1838, I left my chains and succeeded in reaching New York without the slightest interruption of any kind. How I did so, what means I adopted, what direction I traveled, and by what mode of conveyance, I must leave unexplained for the reasons before mentioned. End quote. So again, that's from Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He does not want to get into how he escaped because he wrote this book in 1844, before the Civil War, before the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery is still in play at this point. He doesn't want to give anything away. So I wanted to know how did he get there? And I was thinking, maybe some crazy story. The Underground Railroad or something like that. But he took the regular railroad. But he got someone's free papers. So in Baltimore at that time, there were some free black men, and he got one of their papers and used those and pretended he was that person to be able to get on the train. And he went from Maryland through Delaware, which was also a slave state, into Philadelphia, which was his first time on free soil, and then on to New York City. And then he eventually settled in Rochester, New York. From there, he became dedicated to the cause of abolition, was helping other fugitive slaves gain their freedom, get either to New York or even further on to Canada. Always had a lot of people in and out of his household, and then began speaking. And that is one of the main things that Frederick Douglass is known for. He would just do these extensive tours speaking. He did them in Britain, in England, Scotland, and in Ireland, and all over the United States. So he met with a lot of different presidents. I'll get into that a little bit later in this episode. And he became Marshal of Washington, D.C., and here's what that entails. I'll read a little section here. Shortly after the inauguration in early March, Hayes, so that's Rutherford B. Hayes, put Douglass's name forward for Marshal of the District of Columbia. The appointment as Marshal was the first time in American history that an African American was nominated for a position that required Senate approval. In effect, he helped run the federal court that once adjudicated fugitive slave cases. A little later on, he said, one paper could not resist the ironies of this former outlaw slave, now so central to law enforcement in this role, end quote. Also, one of the roles for this position of as being Marshal of D.C. is that he would march the outgoing president out and then march with the incoming president coming in. So he would be right up there with the outgoing president and the incoming president. He had great worldly success in the sense of speaking all over the world, making great change in people's mind, speaking to black audiences, to white audiences. He also had a really tragic family life, and in this book, it gets in the good, the bad, the ugly, everything about Douglass's life. He suffered greatly. He lost his wife. He lost his son. He lost 10 grandchildren to disease. And then he died on February 20th, 1895 at the age of 77, and he died of a heart attack at his house. The subtitle of this book is Prophet of Freedom. And there's a quote at the very beginning by Douglass, and it's this: "There's a prophet within us, forever whispering that behind the scene lies the immeasurable unseen." So the author of this book has a twofold argument going throughout the book. One is that Douglass's life was guided by the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament. We see that coming through in his knowledge and his use of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then also the story of Exodus. The second part of that argument is that Douglass himself was a prophet. It's a really fascinating way to look at this man's life. His use of the old prophets, his knowledge of the old prophets, taking what they said and applying it to his time, but then also being a prophet himself. So we'll get into that other parts of this episode, but that's really the strong point of this book. As for stats, this one took me 30 hours to read, right at 29 hours and 58 minutes. That was over 28 days, so it was roughly 27 pages per day, as it is a 764-page book. It was worth every minute of those 30 hours, and I'm glad to have spent those 30 hours with Frederick Douglass. For the rest of this episode, in the following two segments, I'll be covering this. In segment 2, the 3 big items that stuck out to me, how other books that I've read for this project interacted with this book, and then also some Frederick Douglass quotes. And then in the final segment, segment 3, I will cover the one thing, my one key takeaway in this book. I want to put a quick feeler out there in hopes that someone who's listening might have some more information. When I was reading this book, I was amazed at the trips that Frederick Douglass did, not only in the United States, but also abroad. And on a couple trips, he spent a lot of time in Scotland, once in 1846 and then again in 1860. And he just traveled all over Scotland and would give speeches. This was the time that George MacDonald was alive in Scotland. And George MacDonald is my wife's favorite author. I read a book by him this year and last year, and I plan to read at least one book a year by that author. So I've started getting really interested in him. And as I was reading this book, I was just wondering, did George MacDonald and Frederick Douglass ever meet? I looked at Douglass's itinerary in his trip in 1846. He spoke in Aberdeen, which is about 40 miles from Huntley, which is where George MacDonald lived. So it's possible that MacDonald could have traveled to see Douglass speak, or even seen him in Glasgow or Edinburgh in one of the other speeches. So it's just a curiosity on my part. If you have more information on that, I'd love to know. The other reason that it sparked an interest is I saw a familiar term used by both men, and that the term is fair play. Douglass used it in this way. Here's a quote from this book. His speech, according to one account, came with 2 stern messages: prescriptions for self-help and hard work for blacks, and for whites his plea to give the freedman fair play and to let him alone, end quote. For George MacDonald, fair play, he often spoke of fair play with the justice of God. And so here's a quote by MacDonald. The justice of God is this: he gives every man, woman, child, and beast everything that has being, fair play, end quote. So that term, it just stuck out to me in the fact that both men used it so often, and it could just be coincidence, but it got me thinking. I just wonder if they met, and it'd be so cool to know if the two men met. But so if you do know if that's written somewhere, I just a quick search online didn't put anything together of the two men having met, but I'd be curious if they did. So back on to the episode here. I want to cover 3 things that stuck out to me in this book, and the first is this: just how Douglass's life paralleled the narrative of the life of the nation. So let me just read a quick paragraph here. And this was as Douglass was returning to areas where he had once been a slave. The newspaper wrote this: he left our county under compulsion. He comes back by invitation. Not to ask pardon to those whom he had disobeyed, but to extend pardon to those by whom he had been wronged. He left as a fugitive. He comes back our equal before law, end quote. This theme comes up a lot in this book, where Douglass returns quite often. He even meets his old masters, his old slave masters, and this contrast of freedom versus slavery. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the Civil War, Douglass traveling to the areas that he was once a slave. And so his life spans this chasm. He grew up under slavery. He escapes to freedom, and it follows the story of what's happening in the nation as a whole. And it's just an amazing thing. There's another part where he returns to Baltimore, and I want to read this part. It was as if he announced that one of the swift-winged angels, the sailing ships of the bay of which he had yearned to fly while imprisoned by Covey, had brought the exiled son home. End quote. What that refers to is a very vivid part of narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It's one thing that I always remember from that book, and it's about midway through the book, and he is looking out over the Chesapeake Bay, and he sees these ships, and he sees these huge white sails on these ships. And he says it is, let me read it. This is from Narrative of the Life. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly round the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing. Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could also go. If I could fly. Oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? End quote. So it's just this vivid imagery of him looking across the Chesapeake Bay. And then we go back again to the quote I just read in Prophet of Freedom book. It was as if he announced that one of the swift-winged angels, the sailing ships of the bay on which he had yearned to fly while imprisoned by Covey, had brought the exiled son home. So again, that shift of before and after. Narrative comes up a lot in different ways as well. So just the narrative of Douglass's life further on, constantly reinventing himself, but staying with a solid core. The question is brought up in this book, what does a radical reformer do if his cause triumphs? And that's where Douglass found himself to some degree after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the Civil War. He had a lot of work to do after that, but he constantly reinvented himself, but stayed true to himself as well. Takes it a step further, though, in this book, in that it's not only his life that is the narrative, but Douglass creates a narrative of what is going on in the United States at this time. Actually, the disunited states in many ways. And so Douglass had a narrative ready for that. And I want to read this one section here. Douglass envisioned the revolution the country now faced as an excellent instructor, especially about the nature of the enemy. He saw in America experiencing an epic upheaval. The drama needed a plot and direction, heroes and villains, and Douglass possessed a ready-made narrative. The slaveholders and their insatiable desires for more expansion, profits, power, and therefore human chattel to achieve their aims had overreached and brought down divine wrath in a political revolution to resist them. Douglass was fond of the Greek proverb that he employed in one of his Sunday lectures, "Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad." In editorials later in the summer, he would put it in other ways. The slaveholder must be master of society, otherwise he cannot long be master of his slaves. Douglass's greatest hope was that a sufficiently outraged northern people would fight to defeat this mortal enemy of humankind. End quote. Second thing that really stuck out to me in this book was his meetings with Abraham Lincoln. I didn't know this. Douglass met with Abraham Lincoln 3 different times. There was actually an invitation for a 4th time, and Douglass had a speaking engagement. He had to turn it down and apparently regretted that because it wasn't long after that Lincoln was assassinated. But there were some really amazing scenes, some pictures of these 2 men meeting that show up in this book. There was a stunned Douglass when Lincoln invites him to the White House. It says here, Lincoln stunned Douglass by inviting him to the White House for an urgent meeting that, in the view of the black leader, would change almost everything once again. This was the second time that they met, and there's an amazing scene of Douglass waiting for the meeting. As Douglass sat in the reception room at the White House awaiting his interview with the president on August 19th, Douglass had a chance encounter with Judge Joseph T. Mills of Wisconsin, who was also awaiting an appointment. In his diary, Mills recorded telling the president the story of how dark it felt in the reception area. So dark that there in the corner, said Mills, I saw a man quietly reading who possessed a remarkable physiognomy. I was riveted to the spot. I stood and stared at him. He raised his flashing eyes and caught me in the act. I was compelled to speak. Said I, Are you the president? No, replied the stranger. I am Frederick Douglass. End quote. I love that. Check this out. I saw a man quietly reading who possessed a remarkable physiognomy. Frederick Douglass is about to meet with Abraham Lincoln, and he's just sitting quietly in the corner reading a book. I just love that. I love that scene. And just the self-possession and the calm of being able to just sit there and read while you're about to meet the president. But just further to this man who is born into slavery being personally invited by the president to meet with him. A final meeting was right after the second inaugural address by Lincoln. Douglass goes to the White House after the day's festivities, and here it goes. Then followed a scene for the ages, as Douglass tells it. Here comes my friend Douglass, announced the president for all to hear. Lincoln said he had seen the orator in the crowd that afternoon listening to the speech and was eager to know his reaction. Douglass demurred, urging the president to attend to his guest. But focused fully on the unmistakable black man with a large mane of graying hair, Lincoln insisted, There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. Mr. Lincoln, replied the former slave from Tuckahoe, that was a sacred effort. We do not know what smaller, deeper talk ensued as the other guests crowded into this special meeting of two parts of America. We can only guess at the thrill in Douglass's heart, knowing that the cause he had so long pleaded, a sanctioned war to destroy slavery and potentially to reinvent the American Republic around the principle of racial equality, might now come to fruition. Standing in the White House East Room, the Chesapeake Bay no great distance out the windows to the east, Douglass could fairly entertain the belief that he and Lincoln, the slaves and the nation, were walking that night into a new history. Just an amazing scene there, and again, the quote is ended. Amazing scene there. Just, and again, Chesapeake Bay brought back into the mind this shift, this change of slavery to freedom, and these meetings with Lincoln that were just so special. The book also talks about the transformation of Lincoln. In early 1860s, he was actually advocating for colonization, which is where people in the whites wanted blacks to move out of the United States, either to Africa or to a part in the Caribbean. And Lincoln was promoting this. He didn't think whites and blacks could live together. And so he was actually even trying to get Douglass to help him promote this. And so you go from that to Lincoln making this inaugural address and Douglass saying, these are the things that I've been saying. So one of the themes that started coming up in Lincoln's speeches was that of rebirth. I'm going to read a section here that kind of talks about this connection. This breathtaking metaphor of rebirth in many versions had long been Douglass's favorite metaphor as well. He had himself delivered variations of the Gettysburg Address throughout the war. Now, with the resounding implications, by the end of that terrible year of 1863, Lincoln and Douglass spoke from virtually the same script. One of them with the elegance and restraint of a statesman, the other the fiery tones of a prophet. One spoke with an eye on legality and public opinion, while also listening to his evolving moral self, and the other as though he were the national evangelist. In Frederick Douglass's view, during the final year and a half of the Civil War, one America died a violent, necessary death. Out of its ashes, a second, refined America came into being amid destruction and explosions of hope. end quote. I skipped around there a little bit, but just this rebirth motif. But I loved what it said there of Lincoln and Douglas speaking from virtually the same script. And just that connection. Douglas had been speaking this for many, many years. And he was at first very, very disturbed by some of the things that Lincoln was saying and believing. And then to see Lincoln change, to see Lincoln begin saying the same things as Douglas must have just been amazing. And then just for these two men to have met 3 different times, just astonishing. Douglas met with many other presidents after that, including a just really disturbing meeting with Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. Just a very derogatory meeting in every sense. The president basically ridiculing Douglas, but was respected by many of the other presidents. So that was my second thing, just these meetings with Lincoln and then also other presidents. The third main thing that stuck out to me in this book was this idea of Douglas being a prophet and then also pulling from the prophets of old. So pulling from the Old Testament, from Exodus, and then the prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah especially. So read different parts of how this played out in Douglas's life. So he pulled Isaiah from his arsenal and delivered what he believed the churches deserved. Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. I cannot away with it. It is iniquity. I am weary to bear them, and when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed. Douglas bore the news that the nation's crimes stood condemned by the prophets of old in the people's own sacred texts. End quote. The next one, the rhythms of Douglas's language are oratorical, and they were deeply indebted, consciously or not, to his life of reading and using the King James Bible. The Bible gave texture to American prose, and the King James translation, according to Robert Alter, became the wellspring of eloquence and the national book of the American people. That is where any puzzle about Douglas's source of style should be solved. End quote. And one more about Douglas as prophet. Douglas believed events gave evidence that a moral chemistry and an interventionist God now drove history forward. He had rehearsed for this moment for more than 20 years. A prophet issues the warnings and must be ready to reap history's results. Words, faith, inspiration, and abiding pathos, argues Abraham Heschel, are the prophetic stock in trade. A prophet spares no piety. He is an assaulter of the mind. The words of a true prophet, say Heschel, are a scream in the night, rooted in a sense of history, and timing may be all. With a reasoned scream, Douglas discerned that Babylon might now be falling. End quote. The other area in which Douglas was a prophet was a lot in the sense of calling, well, first predicting some sort of a war as a result of slavery. And then once it started, calling it what it was from the very beginning. He called it the Abolition War and said it was 100% about slavery. I'm going to read different things leading up to the war, some of these many years before the war. He said, slavery will be attacked in its stronghold. The compromisers of the Constitution and the cry of disunion shall be more fearlessly proclaimed till slavery be abolished, the union dissolved, or the sum of this guilty nation must go down in blood. The contest must now be decided and decided forever, which of the two, freedom or slavery, shall give law to this republic. Let the conflict come, and God speed the right. That was in March of 1861. That first one where he said slavery will be attacked in its stronghold was in 1848. And then we have a little later on, Douglas saying this on page 352. From the beginning of secession, Douglas had called the crisis, the slaveholders' rebellion. Since Fort Sumter, he had called for an abolition war and nothing short of it. When we consider his impatience with the Lincoln administration's halting and sometimes hostile approach to emancipation, it is worth contemplating the lens through which Douglass judged the war's purpose. In August, Douglass righteously claimed that everyone knows that this is the slaveholders' rebellion and nothing else. The war, he said, was the work of a privileged class of irresponsible despots, authorized tyrants, and bloodsuckers who fasten upon the Negro's flesh and draw political power in consequence from their legal crimes. We didn't go into this war to put down slavery. This is Lincoln talking now. We didn't go into this war to put down slavery, but to put back the flag back. For I never should have had enough votes to send me here if the people had supposed I would use my power to upset slavery. End quote. So again, just interesting to see Douglass saying one thing, Lincoln saying another, and then Lincoln changing his tune later on. But just that prophetic voice of Douglass in calling it the abolition war from the beginning. I want to highlight a few different books that connect deeply with this book, and these are all books that I've read for this project. The first is obviously Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and if you've not read that book, you need to read it. It's short, but it packs a punch, and you may even want to read that one before you read this one, Prophet of Freedom. Next is the Bible. It plays such a huge role in Douglass's life, and as the author does a fantastic job in this book, just shows how Douglass's reading of the Bible, his reading of the prophets, led him to become the man that he was. The third book is The Prophets by Abraham Heschel. In one of the quotes I just read, David Blight mentions Heschel, and that's a book I read last year, The Prophets, and it was just cool to see that referenced over and over in this book. And the last one that I thought about was The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. And that is a book about a serial killer, but it's also a book about the Chicago Exposition of 1893. And what's interesting is I went back and looked at this book, and there's not a single mention of Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass played a pretty big and important role at that Chicago exposition. And this book by David Blight gets into that role and the things that he did there. So I just found it interesting. And obviously you can't go into every detail in a book like The Devil in the White City, but I just found it really fascinating that there was so much that Douglass did at that exposition, and it didn't even make it into that book. Finally, here I wanted to go through a few different quotes by Douglass and do 5 of my favorites. Here's the first. I will not detain you long, for I stand here a slave at least in the eyes of the Constitution. It is a slave by the laws of the South who now addresses you. My back is scarred by the lash that I would show you. I would I could make visible the wounds of this system upon my soul. End quote. Number 2, he is the best friend of this country who, at this tremendous crisis, dares tell his countrymen the truth, however disagreeable that truth may be. And such a friend I will aim to be. End quote. Number 3, the invisible chains of slavery may take many generations to break. This is, again, one of those more kind of prophetic utterances. The invisible chains of slavery. So he had experienced the visible chains, the chains around his arms, his leg. He had experienced that, but he knew going forward it was not going to be an easy switch. And so he talked about these invisible chains of slavery that will take many generations to break. Number 4, my day has been a pleasant one. My joys have far exceeded my sorrows, and my friends have brought me far more than my enemies have taken away from me. End quote. When you read this book and you see all that Douglass went through, for him to make a statement like that is pretty amazing. And number 5, a man must defend himself if only to demonstrate his fitness to defend anything else. A man must defend himself, if only to demonstrate his fitness to defend anything else. In these episodes, I always cover the one thing. I end each episode with the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Oftentimes, it's also the thing that has stuck out to me the most as I've read the book. And that's the case with this one. I want to read a little antidote from the third to last page in the book. As the meal ended, all repaired to the sitting room, and the old orator, Douglass, demanded they all sing. Grandson Joseph took the lead on the violin, and someone else played the piano. Grimke remembered poignantly, in the singing he, Douglass, took the lead. The guests left this unforgettable image of the host. Standing in the doorway between the sitting room and the hall, with violin in hand, he struck up, "In thy cleft, O Rock of Ages," and sang it through to the very end with a pathos that moved us all. It seemed to take hold of him so. Grimke witnessed Douglass's spirituality in full force. I can almost hear now the deep mellow tones of his voice and feel the solemnity that pervaded the room as he sang the words, "In the sight of Jordan's billow, let thy bosom be my pillow. Hide me, O thou rock of ages, safe in thee." Grimke felt a kind of presentiment that the end was near, that he, Douglass, was already standing on the very brink of that Jordan over which he was soon to pass. End quote. There's a lot going on in this scene. First, Douglass's grandson is there, and his grandson plays the violin. He is actually a concert violinist, and one whom Douglass himself has given a lot of money to be able to pursue this love of the violin. So the grandson's there, and he's leading on the violin. You also have Douglass standing with his own violin, and Douglass taught himself to play the violin and would play it at different points in his life. Third, this story is being told by Grimke, who is a Presbyterian minister who had actually married Douglass and his second wife. So close friends, and he had him over. Douglass had him over at his house. Fourth, this is 3 weeks before Douglass has a heart attack and dies in this same exact house where this scene is taking place. And fifth, knowing that this is just 3 weeks until he dies, you see a man here standing, singing with his full heart and singing with his full soul. He did not lose his faith. Amidst it all, as you read this book and you see the hardships, you see the hardships in his own family, you see what he went through as a slave, the pain, the derogatory comments he had throughout his life, getting kicked off trains for being black, all of these things, and yet with 3 weeks to go in his life, he stands and he just sings in his deep baritone voice this hymn with everything inside of him. Oh, to have been a fly in the wall at that meeting, at that dinner. It reminded me of another one thing that I pulled from the book about Einstein. And I covered Walter Isaacson's book about Einstein a few years ago, I believe. And the one thing from that book, the one story of the man was not the speeches he gave or the time in front of all these people or the theories he came up with. It was when Einstein was invited to a prayer meeting. And Einstein was Jewish. He was atheist in a lot of ways in his beliefs, but he was invited to a prayer meeting, a Christian prayer meeting in the United States. And that prayer meeting was called together to pray for the Jews being persecuted by the Nazis in Germany. Einstein had experienced some of that himself. He'd been effectively kicked out of Germany where he was working because he was Jewish. He had family members and friends who were being persecuted and were being killed by the Nazis. And so as a Jew or even as an atheist, the last place you would ever picture Einstein showing up is at this meeting, a prayer meeting of Christians. But he goes, and it's one where they just go around in a circle and pray. And when it comes to him, he has his violin with him. He stands up, picks up his violin, and plays a song with all of his heart, and then sits down, never uttering a word. And that was my one key takeaway from that book, and it reminded me a lot of this scene in Douglass's life. Of all the adulations, of all the things that Douglass did, to have this scene at the end of his life, that spoke more to me than all of these other things that he did in his life. Just this strong faith to the end. So that's my one thing, my one key takeaway. It was such a beautiful scene, such a beautiful thing to consider. When I read books, I have different methods of marking to signify when something is important. So one of them is just simply underlining, and I'll underline or kind of mark off whole sections if I think it's important. If it's even more important, I will put a star by it, and then I will write that at the end of the chapter, and then in the end of the book, I will also write it. So if there's a star by it, there's a good chance I kind of rewrite that at the back of the book. So I can pick off any book in my library and just open the back cover and look at the notes, the main things that I want to remember. If something is truly astonishing, if something just kind of blows me away, I go one step further, and next to the star, I write, wow. For these episodes, for these podcast episodes, I can usually go back through the book and talk about the things that I wrote wow next to. And for any given book, it's usually just one or two things. And that will oftentimes be my main thing, my one thing that I highlight in the episode. And for something to have a wow by it, it means that I was not expecting it, and it was a powerful, powerful thing. The reason I share this is I had a ton of wows that I wrote in this book about the life of this man. And as I was reading it, I was kind of thinking in my head of how I could do this podcast episode, because it's such a huge book. And maybe I would just cover the things that I wrote now wow next to. But as I was preparing for this episode, I wrote wow so many times that this episode would have been too long. And this was just one of those books. It was full of amazing stories of an amazing life. I really want to encourage you to read this book. It is long. It took work, but it is one of the most important books I've read for this project. I would place it probably in the top 10. It's not because of the prose. It's not because of the incredible writing. Yes, it won a Pulitzer, but that's when you read this book, you're not thinking about the author, and much to the author's credit. This book wows you because of the man, because of Frederick Douglass and what he did and what he said and the profound impact he had and continues to have on the United States. Throughout reading this book, I had a really strong desire to hear Douglass's voice. And I just didn't know enough about the history of recordings to know if at the time of his death in 1895, if that was even possible. But that question was actually answered in this book. And towards the end of Douglass's life, he's at a friend's house, and this friend has a phonograph. And here are some of the things that Douglass says. The phonograph brought me nearest to a sense of divine creative power than anything I have witnessed before. It raises the question as to the boundary of the human soul, the dividing line between the finite and the infinite. Douglass's reaction to this machine revealed much about himself. He found something solemn in the thought that, though being dead and turned to dust, a man's voice may yet live and speak. His reaction was genuinely spiritual. I feel, and this is quoting Douglass, I feel somewhat over this instrument in your hands as a man feels when he embraces religion. The faces and forms of our departed were important, but the thing makes us hear their voices. That's the end of Douglass's quote, but I'm still in Blight's quote here. We have no evidence that Douglass ever recorded on a phonograph, but he desired nothing more than that his spoken and written voice would survive infinitely for humankind. Survive it did by other means, end quote. Thought that was beautiful, and how much I would love to hear that baritone voice giving some of these speeches. We don't have that. But it doesn't really matter because he left his writing, he left his speeches, he left his words, his portrait, and his prophecy. This book, to recap, is an important one. It covers Douglass. It covers his whole life. It covers the glory. It covers his failures. It covers his successes. His life spans the narrative of the biggest shift in the history of this country. He spoke to Black and white Americans. He wrote some of the most memorable books and gave some of the most important speeches in our history. He looked for guidance to the past, to the prophets, to Moses, and to Exodus. But he also looked to the founding documents, to the Constitution. He at times despaired of the people and at other times called them to live out the Constitution and the amendments and the prophets. His life is one that is worthy of study. It is worth 30 hours of your life, at least, to study this man. And I strongly encourage that you read this book. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. I'd love to hear of your experience with Frederick Douglass, if you've read his other works. He has other books. I have a desire to read the other ones that he has written. At some point, though, it'd be good for you to read this one as well, this biography. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that at booksoftitans.com/support. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram and Twitter, and the website is stock full of resources to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. I'll be back next week discussing another book from my 2020 reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.